Fleslet. 15-minute cities have been in the headlines over the past couple of months, either through excess of marketing, as if it's a new concept, or through excess of bureaucratic zeal combined with misunderstandings and hubris, such as the one seen in Oxford. Before this controversy, there was smart cities, a combination of tech grift, some relatively useful but minor stuff, and, yes, some authoritarian nonsense. So what are 15-minute smart cities? Are they dangerous? Will they go wrong? Or it's just a case study of conspiracy paranoia, as the totally objective, absolutely not billionaire-owned, special interest-driven Bloomberg called the issue. Luckily, I live in a 15-minute smart city, except it's not called that way. Well, sort of. It is called now because the grift is so good. And the reason it's not called that way is because the idea is much older than 2020, though you wouldn't know that by googling the issue, largely because quite a few of those who promote 15-minute cities don't know where it comes from either. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative and welcome to the less glamorous parts of my hometown. It took me a while to gather the footage for this video because the weather was primarily terrible and cold throughout much of April. However, I wanted to show you around my town because most of the things that form the practicality of what I'm about to say have already been implemented in my hometown. Or at least those that fit the category of mostly useless, mostly grift or corruption, and somewhat useful, while so far eschewing most of the craziness seen in other places. So, for the purposes of this talk, the presentation is divided as follows. 1. What is microrayon? 2. What are smart cities in theory and practice? 3. What are 15-minute cities really? 4. How can this go wrong? Spoiler alert, it will. And 5. Some conclusions. Alright, so the main contention of this video is that the idea behind 15-minute cities is far from new and it is, in fact, quite old. Fundamentally, 15-minute cities are the Soviet policy of microrayon, but with a smiley face and marketed for a terminally online Western audience and with some tech grift interwoven in it. Microrayon, or micro-district according to some English language literature, was a city planning Soviet policy for residential areas. Just like 15-minute cities, its goals were quite identical: to create residential areas that have as many of the necessities of life within walking distance from the resident's home. The name microrayon comes from the way the Soviet Union divided lands administratively. The USSR was divided into union republics, such as Kazakh SSR, Uzbek SSR, Ukrainian SSR, and so on and so forth. Then each union republic was then divided into oblasts, with the exception of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which also had krais and okrugs. Well, present-day Russia still has those too. Now, some union republics, such as Moldova or Estonia, either briefly had or never had oblasts to begin with. Now, each oblast, or each union republic, in the case of those without oblasts, was further divided administratively into rayons. These areas would incorporate several villages, communes, and towns around a slightly larger city. To be declared a city of rayon importance, it needed a certain population level and the presence of certain level of minimal amenities, from essential food distribution facilities to fun stuff like sports facilities, a certain number of schools, and so on and so forth. This process was in fact one of simplification, though it certainly doesn't seem like that today. The process, started 100 years ago in 1923, wanted to replace the complicated administrative local bureaucracy inherited from the Russian Empire, which divided the lands into krais, okrugs, autonomous lands, volosts, uyezds, and quite a few other entities. Long story short, the process was far from easy, and some autonomies, krais and okrugs, ended up surviving Lenin, Stalin, the Stakhanovite reform, the age of stagnation, Gorbachev, and all the way into present day. But also 100 years ago, the Soviet Union came up with the idea of expanding the cities. At that time, the Soviet urban planning ideologies emphasized communal living, with compact territories with residential dwellings, schools, shops, entertainment facilities, and green spaces. You know, kinda like what you're looking at right now, except uglier, grayer, and poorer. To maintain the trend of simplifying bureaucracies, the Soviet Politburo, in its infinite wisdom, called these urban planning strategies mikrorayon. The conditions were quite similar for a regular rayon. A certain number of schools, a certain number of shops, and a certain number of people had to be in a place in order to be approved as a mikrorayon. Between 1920 and 1950, tens of thousands of such ensembles were built throughout the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, I can't show you those because not many of them survived to this day, and of those that did, most are in contemporary Russia. The reasons they didn't survive are plentiful, starting from the fact that they weren't always well built and continuing with the fact that when people had a choice, they chose not to stay in them because the dwellings were constructed using the Leninist playbook. No privacy, showers on the hallway, communal living. After the death of Stalin, the process was standardized and changed quite significantly, and from then on it remained basically unchanged mostly till present day. Out went the communal bathrooms, out went the rigid limits on population. Now larger than ever dwellings were not only permitted but encouraged, and because of economy of scale, a lot more were now possible to build as well. It is this model that was then exported to other places outside of the USSR as well, such as my country or China. Now, the name mikrorayon didn't survive in many places. There are a few neighborhoods in Romanian cities that are called mikro followed by a number, but by and large this was disfavored. The Romanian communist authorities, now in the process of de-Russification, preferred to either use the pre-existent name of the area or, if ideologically incompatible, the name of a national personality or a cardinal point. But whether they're called mikrorayon or not, the neighborhoods built in late 1950s and through the 1980s in my hometown are, for all intents and purposes, mikrorayons. So, here's Zorilor neighborhood. Zorilor roughly means of the rising sun, and the neighborhood is in the city's east. Told you the commies were highly inspired with names. Not that post-communists were better inspired either. I mean, there's a neighborhood further east to this one that is called Good Day. Anyway, this neighborhood doesn't have too many tall buildings, and most of those that do exist are built in post-communism, but it has the mandatory mikrorayon center. Now, sure, today it looks nowhere near as bad and crammed as it was back in communism, but the architectural features are mostly unchanged. This mikrorayon center, located between the apartment buildings, is the standard for all mikrorayon-like neighborhoods. So here's Flora Market in Mănăștur neighborhood. Here the buildings are taller, but the idea remains the same. The center is away from a big motorway and between the buildings, so those living there can walk to the market within minutes. Here's Ion Meșter Market from the same neighborhood, but different mikrorayon. The exact same thing. One exception is the market from Grigorescu neighborhood. It still looks the same and the idea is the same, but it's located a bit on the edge and much closer to the motorway. One of the reasons for this difference is because this neighborhood was where the nomenclatura used to live. And the nomenclatura was far more likely to own an automobile, and their apartments were larger, hence their buildings were larger, and the hill that you can see behind limited the construction potential, so geography forced things to be adapted. But perhaps the epitome of microrayon 15-minute city is this building. Walking around it takes about 10 minutes if you walk fast. It was either the largest or the second largest apartment building in Europe until about 10 years ago. It wasn't the tallest, but its surface and number of apartments is simply huge. An entire village was moved here when it was built. Now, in post-communism, this massive apartment building can be a 15-minute city by itself. You can get food, furniture, telecom services, gambling, banking, prescription drugs, beauty services, some private schooling, children's products, primary medical care, even eye surgery, all without leaving the building. I was thinking out loudly when I was taping these images, and as you can see, the building really is never ending, that if this building had been used as an ad for 15-minute cities, Westerners would have protested much more vigorously than they have already against this idea. It should be noted, though, that this building is an exception rather than the rule, not just in Romania, but everywhere in the Intermarium or other places where microrayon were a thing. The main indicator of microrayon policy are these kinds of markets shoved in between apartment buildings. Also, these kinds of things are what proponents of 15-minute cities today dream about. Now, to be fair, today in a freer market context, these things aren't bad at all and are quite convenient, but when they were built, and until 1990, they weren't. Because they were built by people with very similar ideas to those who now push 15-minute cities, with the idea of control, though in practice the microrayon people did not envision locking people down in their neighborhoods like the clowns in Oxfordshire do, so there's that. With all of that said, microrayons, at least in contemporaneity, are, for all intents and purposes, a real-life incarnation of 15-minute cities. Most of what one needs, if one lives in the inner city, is available within 15 to 20-minute walk. Not much of cycling most of the time, because most of the time the weather is terrible and it's a very hilly city. Now, this didn't stop the Western-inspired grift from being implemented here, mind you, though in a limited fashion only in the flatter parts of the city. More on that later in the video. Chapter 2. What are smart cities in theory and practice? So as I was saying in the intro, that before the 15-minute city controversy, there was another loaded term with potentially dangerous consequences to personal liberty: smart cities. Now, while the term fell out of fashion over the last 2 years, it is still widely used in policy papers and lobbying notes by big tech. And just like 15-minute cities, it means whatever the speaker wants them to mean. According to the European Commission's portal, a smart city is, quote, a place where traditional networks and services are made more efficient with the use of digital solutions for the benefit of its inhabitants and businesses. A smart city goes beyond the use of digital technologies for better resource and use less emissions. It means smarter urban transport networks, upgraded water supply and waste disposal facilities, and more efficient ways to light and heat buildings. It also means a more interactive and responsive city administration, safer public spaces, and meeting the needs of an aging population, unquote. Working with this definition, it's easy to see how this can be quite bad. How would you make public spaces safer using technology? Well, mass surveillance, that's how. At its core, the idea behind smart cities is illiberal and techno-optimistic. In practice, however, smart cities end up being a never-ending series of grifts to the benefit of both local and multinational tech corporations. For instance, these ticketing machines differ from the ticketing machines of non-smart cities. In non-smart cities, the ticketing machines are mostly electromechanical. 5 to 10 options and very simple printing, and that's it, and they last for decades. In my home smart city, the ticketing machines have all sorts of bloatware. 2 card readers, one for bank cards and one for local cards, and run a relatively complex piece of software, and of course, it has a surveillance camera too, because heaven forbid you buy a bus ticket without Big Brother knowing. These machines are well built hardware-wise, but software-wise, they break down quite routinely, which is great grift for the local tech bros who get paid obscene amounts to maintain the smart delusion. Another fixture to have resulted from the smart cities delusion is the ubiquity of USB ports, in public transport and even on random benches on the street. Now, in addition to the fact that those ports are simply not good enough to charge most phones as they don't have the amperage power, it is in fact a terrible idea to use them to begin with. Even the FBI strongly advises people not to use them as they pose a security risk. Now, to be fair, these ones from the bench don't pose a serious security risk because they're not usable, but still. To make things worse, this grift is spreading. Here's random USB ports in Vidin, Bulgaria. At least my hometown has the basics in order, but Vidin has so many basic public services either dysfunctional or straight up missing. But hey, something was done. Also under the umbrella of smart cities, older projects were slightly altered in order to get more grift money from the Европейский Союз, such as this street. This street was touted as the first smart street in Romania, only to then use the same marketing label a few more times during 2020 and 2021. The bulk of the work on this street was, in fact, boring, mundane, and necessary stuff, such as straightening the street, widen the curve so that the trolley bus no longer risks hitting pedestrians when it turns right from the boulevard, or fix the pavement on the sidewalk. But you can't get EU funds for something mundane, so what you do is frame everything as we're building smart cities, yo. So add some USB ports, some talking garbage bins. Yes, seriously, these garbage bins sometimes say thank you, but only when the sun is out for long enough for the batteries to be charged. And there you go. Now it's no longer merely updating decrepit urban infrastructure, but using transformative technology to bring a better way of life in the digital realm, or some similarly convoluted tech grift bullshit. Keep in mind that this is loved by the so-called tech industry. Tens of millions of euros per street are gobbled up by all sorts of tech contractors, and of course a portion of the money ends up in China, especially for these talking garbage bins whose solar panels are all made in the People's Republic of China. You can also observe how seriously the whole thing is taken, given that this one is placed in the shade, thus all but guarantee they never work as intended, as silly as that may be. Oh, and I forgot about these validators, which also routinely don't exactly work. Initially, these were popular because they replaced some difficult-to-operate mechanical validators. However, they run into controversies not only because they would malfunction quite often, but also because at one point the city tried to abolish the paper tickets and the anonymous cards, thus making it impossible to travel within the city anonymously. Lawsuits were threatened, since this was in fact unconstitutional, and eventually a relatively satisfying compromise was reached with one exception. Before the smart cities grift, if you paid for a subscription, then that was it. You just carry that card with you and show it when asked for it, and you're all set. Now, under smart cities, extra burdens are placed on you. You have to validate a card every time you get into the vehicle, even if you have a subscription, including if you have a partially or totally subsidized one like those for students or pensioners, an aspect which led to a lot of conflicts between babushkas and city employees, since you also need to click something on a touchscreen if you're using a different line that has a common road with the line you're subscribed to. So, rather than make life easier, smart cities either had no impact on day-to-day life, or in fact it made it slightly harder. But this does fit with the philosophy, which is to gather data, something which every sane person should see as a terrible thing, but there aren't that many sane people in this town, so there's that. Also, of the sane people that exist in this town, half of them are connected to the tech grifts, so they won't say out loud that this is purulent cancer out of fear of no longer being invited to the correct parties where new grifts are being distributed. So the Great Grift Forward, otherwise known as Smart Cities, continues. Chapter 3. What are 15-minute cities really? So I've spent quite some time describing and showing microrayons and smart cities for what they are rather than what their proponents claim they are. 15-minute cities in practice are a combination of microrayon with smart cities and some corruption, authoritarianism and straight-up delusion on top. This iteration of microrayon, 15-minute cities, is, just like the previous ones, a socialist idea. Now, when you describe it like this, plenty of people retort with things, yeah, wanting to have amenities within walking distance is so communism. But that's a red herring, of course. The idea of wanting to have amenities within walking distance obviously is not communism, but 15-minute cities as an idea absolutely is a socialist one. It got revamped by the Colombian-French academic Carlos Moreno about 4 years ago. Mr. Moreno, who lives in Paris, was a member of M19, which is a far-left terrorist organization turned political party in Colombia. Now, in his older age, Mr. Moreno is a big proponent of green cities and is basically the inventor of this latest iteration of microrayon policy. He even got awards for it in 2019 and 2021, and the first politician to take him seriously was Anne Hidalgo, the socialist mayor of Paris. So to say that 15-minute cities is a socialist idea is a statement of fact. It comes from a socialist, it derives inspiration from Soviet ideas about planning, and in practice, in some places, it already attempted to impose itself via coercion, so definitely socialist. What makes 15-minute cities different from microrayon is the fact that the current proponents are targeting different areas of human comfort in cities, and they also unironically believe that they can transform existent cities. The Soviet microrayons were not built in the old towns, but on the edges of the old towns, thus expanding the city and the urban environment overall. The 15-minute cities people, however, want to transform existing cities and infrastructure to better fit their vision, so in many ways it's a more radical view than the Soviet one. With that said, there are in fact some caveats. In many ways, the people who dismiss any concerns with this are definitely wrong, either through ignorance or through the fact that they favor authoritarianism because petty tyrants are never properly put in their place. But the people who think 15-minute cities are the end of the world are also quite wrong, at least in practice. For starters, Moreno's ideas benefited from better marketing, but even the modern post-Soviet iteration idea is still older than Moreno's ideas. For instance, Mr. Kent Larson from MIT in 2012 proposed the 20-minute city under the assumption that the planet is becoming, quote, a network of cities and that successful cities in the future will evolve into a network of high-performance, resilient entrepreneurial communities, unquote. So notice the word resilient, which saw a surge since 2020, and it's another buzzword from this madness. Luca Dacci, who is the head of urban management and climate change at some bullshit think tank at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, proposed a T-minute city in 2013, where T is a reasonable time to reach destination by walking. What all of these have in common is the idea that you can simulate the wills and needs of hundreds of thousands or millions of people through a computer model. The experience in the pandemic project should tell you just how bad this is. And to be fair to these petty, vulgar tyrants, they know it too. which is why they love the smart cities grift, especially the part where they gather all or as much as possible of your personal data, which they think they can then use to make better predictions about you. And to be fair, they're not entirely wrong. After all, you all buy voluntarily expensive smartphones which you then cough up data with for these petty tyrants whose computers end up knowing you quite well. But then again, whenever I mention the fact that using a smartphone is actively dangerous for your freedom, I'm called a Luddite because, heaven forbid, we live like we lived in 2005 when we still had fast internet, instant banking, ATMs, and even social media, just not supercomputers with a GPS in almost everyone's pockets. With all of that being said, though, the biggest problem with these ideas is not that they're necessarily evil. Again, I live in a 15-minute city and it's a good place to live. The problem is that where they're needed the most, they're not implemented. And instead, they're being implemented by terrible people where they're not needed at all. Most cities in continental Europe are already quite walkable and usually have at least semi-decent public transport. Or, if they don't, the infrastructure is already there and all that's needed is the political will to revamp it. The other problem is that these ideas have been forcibly married with the climate change narrative, not to be confused with climate change, which is a real phenomenon. The climate change narrative is the conspiracy theory that you can change the weather by paying more taxes or lowering your comfort. And unfortunately, lots of proponents of 15-minute cities believe, or at least profess to believe, in this extremist idea, largely because it's for their own financial benefit. Again, it's all about the grift. Even in the extreme example of Oxford, the reason the local bureaucrats went for coercion is not because they give two hoots about the climate or whatever, it's because the fines are a steady revenue stream. Another reason why skepticism to all of this is justified is the utter lack of logic in practice. So, for instance, my hometown uses these things. They're called trolley buses. They've been around for almost 90 years in my hometown. Towns in the Intermarium routinely feature trolley buses. They're big, silent, relatively easy to maintain, and less polluting than diesel buses. Also, unlike the Chinese-made electric buses, trolley buses can draw more power when needed to climb up hills, which is highly important in hilly cities, such as my hometown. The cities in the United Kingdom had these too from 1911 till early 1970s, but then they scrapped them because potato. And now, instead of bringing them back, because yes, seriously, they do contribute positively to the air quality in the city, but instead of bringing them back, the localities engage in these weird games with zones and cameras. Look, I get it. Cars are terrible. I am in fact a big fan of reducing the number of cars in the cities. But to do that, you first need lots and lots of carrots. Yet British cities went straight to the stick. And then they wonder why they get a backlash. And no, calling people who are skeptical conspiracy theorists won't work either. You don't have to be a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracist to be concerned with the idea of issuing permits that would allow you 100 exits from your zone per year. Any normal person should be concerned with such extremist policies. Most cities in Germany had trolley buses too. Now only 2, both in the former DDR, still retain them. The fact of the matter is that West Europe and Britain actively encouraged automobiles by policy choice, by destroying functional public transport, neglecting the railways, and irrationally widening the streets under the mentality that just one more lane will solve the traffic, and, fun fact, it didn't. Those policy choices now translate in cities where you can't breathe normally. But the solution to that is not yet another revolution without any regard for human liberty and for trade-offs, which is exactly how the 15-minute cities push comes off as, even if that is not necessarily the intent or even the practice. And this is a good segue to Chapter 4. How can this go wrong? Well, I mentioned earlier that the pushers of these ideas have already pissed off the public. So a highly skeptical public is bound to create even more problems without solving any. I also mentioned already the potential for authoritarian excesses, which is something that the public is keenly aware of and for good reason. You can't trust bureaucrats with power. But there are also other, less visible ways through which these ideas can and likely will go wrong. Take, for instance, the security threat. In addition to public USB chargers being infected with all sorts of malware, think of data leaks. City halls try to gather more data about their citizens, allegedly to improve the lives of citizens through a so-called responsive administration. But what exactly stops them from selling the data to whomever they please? And the answer is nothing. In fact, if you have the patience and a few thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin, you can already buy mobility data from various metropolises around the world. And some of that is gathered through the so-called smart cities features, and the data is explicitly gathered for 15-minute cities projects. Then there's the national security aspect, which only some countries are finally waking up to. Under the guise of either smart cities or improving security, too many cities have filled up with surveillance cameras. In addition to the threat to civil liberties, let's just stop and think about the fact that these real-time broadcasters are all made in China. And speaking of China, a significant portion of electric buses bought by so many municipalities across Europe, mostly via EU, though not always, they're also made in China. Meanwhile, the trolley buses are still made in Europe. Yet European cities prefer to buy Chinese rather than local and overall spend more because electric buses are far more expensive to maintain and also last less than trolley buses. And do European cities prefer Chinese, or they have been penetrated by CCP influence and money? Given how many Confucius Institutes exist in so many 15-minute smart cities, the question is a very legitimate one. What I am saying basically is that even if one agrees with the objectives of the 15-minute cities, the way they are so often implemented is in itself a cause for concern. To add insult to the injury, given that no consideration is given to recent history, some cities will for sure be made worse by trying to turn them into 15-minute cities, either because they were already livable and really didn't need any of this, or by creating an upward pressure on the price of real estate where none existed prior, thus pricing the locals out of being able to continue to live in their city. The latter occurred and continues to occur in my hometown. The constant barrage of propaganda about how great this smart city is has also been one of the factors, though by no means the only one or even the decisive one, but still one of the factors that made this city unaffordable. Other factors were the influx of tech grifts, now finally trimmed, inshallah. But employees of tech grifts have been wildly overpaid for so long that they distorted the real estate market. Luckily, my hometown ignored the commies, unlike Berlin, so the problem eventually solved itself somewhat by market means. With that said, we can't discount the disruption brought into the city life by trying to implement these ideas, a disruption which may or may not be necessary depending on the circumstances, and a trade-off that should ultimately be decided by the voters and not by appointed bureaucrats. In fairness, in my hometown, the voters decided it. All of this was transparent, and the current administration can expect a third consecutive re-election. But as we've seen in other places, this isn't always the case. In way too many places, the voters are kept in the dark and then faced with a fait accompli situation. This is dangerous. In a world angrier than it has ever been in the last 40 years, pissing off the plebs with ill-conceived ideas that are so good that they need to be mandatory is a recipe for a lot of violence. And here, in my neck of the woods, where mayors get beaten up and nearly lynched unironically if they fuck things up, let's just say that I'm not concerned that much. Mayors have an incentive here to listen to complaints. But in West Europe, where city halls are just as an opaque bureaucracy as the national ones, not to mention other demographic issues that really don't exist here, I'm afraid that an aggressive push will not go down nicely. Ultimately, this policy will go wrong most of the time in most of the places for reasons that have very little to do with the policy itself and quite a lot to do with the fact that we're working with free people and not with machines or serfs. corruption, violence, data leaks, malfunction, bankruptcy, one of these or a combination of these will necessarily tame or straight up stop most initiatives. Let's just hope enough mayors see this before they learn it the hard way. And finally, Chapter 5, some conclusions. Now, I left the most controversial part here. I mentioned earlier that 15-minute cities are not implemented where they're needed the most, and instead a lot of the time and energy is being spent where they are either should not be implemented at all, or in places where the cost is higher than the benefit, even if we assume nothing goes wrongly. What I mean by that is the cities of North America. With very few exceptions, the cities of North America are pure, unadulterated, uninhabitable cancer from an urban planning perspective. That's how Americans and Canadians ended up with a coddled generation of children, among other societal ills. The destruction of the cities to make them more car-friendly led to the practical impossibility of leaving children to wander alone from an early age, which is still the norm in Europe. It wasn't always like that. Less than 70 years ago, North American cities were walkable and beautiful. They were more polluted, but still overall safer. And they had functional public transport too. And all with much lower budgets than today and overall lower fiscal burden. The fact of the matter is that the extremism in urban planning in North America was also a policy choice. Few Americans are aware today that the car-dependent suburbia is in fact subsidized and not the result of the free market. Also, few Americans realize just how insane it is to have zoning laws that effectively means you have to drive 30 kilometers or more for a pack of cigarettes or some milk. It is in North America, not in Europe, where some 15-minute cities would be very good, though most certainly the policy shouldn't be called like that. But seriously, at least allowing for convenience stores to be opened where people live rather than in remote commercial centers accessible only by car, that is something that should be done yesterday. So far, only Ron DeSantis has signed into law something like this, the Live Local Act, a bill that strips the NIMBYs from enforcing their narrow will on everyone else. You don't have to be a climate fanatic to see that it is crazy to have to drive for basically anything. Indeed, you don't have to buy into any aspect of the climate narrative. Heck, I don't. Under the guise of protecting the character of the community, legit totalitarian control over the market is being exerted by NIMBY Karens who get the power to regulate what you do on your land way beyond what's reasonable. I mean, it's one thing to forbid the building of a chemical plant next to your house, but it's a whole different thing to also forbid opening up a convenience store or to forbid the construction of a bigger building that houses 3 or 4 families. Long story short, trying to make the cities more walkable, trying to reduce car dependency and increase options is not communism, and it is not inherently an attack on liberty. In fact, it is quite weird to equate automobile use with freedom, given that its use is tied with excessive taxation and the whims of not just one government, your own, but also the whims of governments you have no control over, such as the government of Saudi Arabia. When Mohammed bin Salman remembers that he really despises Joe Biden personally, your cost of using the car goes up and there's nothing you can do about it. Meanwhile, the electric train running on locally produced electricity stands a much lower chance of being unaffordable due to external factors. However, in practice, this issue will remain contentious because so many of the proponents of 15-minute cities are themselves crazy authoritarians on a power trip or direct beneficiaries of various grifts. Like the electric vehicle grift, electric cars aren't a modern invention. They've been around for over 120 years and they never caught on for the exact same reason they aren't exactly catching on now either. They're just not good. Trying to ban normal cars altogether to force adoption of electric cars won't make electric cars better. But building better public transport may reduce the overall number of cars, especially if public transport is then also prioritized in traffic to reduce time spent on the road. It also doesn't help that the proponents of various derivatives of 15-minute cities have a fetish with bicycles. Now, my personal bias and straight-up disdain for bicycles notwithstanding, it's also just a fact of life that most cities in Europe and North America have at least 200 days a year when riding a bicycle is simply not doable. It's either too cold or it's raining. Besides, you'll never convince families with 2 or 3 children to bicycle around. Not to mention older people who would in fact gain freedom if safe and functional public transport would be available. But all of that requires nuanced thinking and, most importantly, requires one not to be ideologically possessed. And that won't be easy and may in fact be impossible in the next 20 years or so. So, to sum up, 15-minute cities, as observed in practice, aren't necessarily an evil authoritarian thing, and in some cases, and with the necessary nuanced implementation, can even be a good thing. But while some exaggerated or straight-up insane claims have been made by those who oppose 15-minute cities, it is nevertheless legitimate and indeed healthy to take no as the default position on such proposals, precisely because governments, local and national, have proven themselves time and time again to not be worthy of trust. Always read the fine print, and always ask the hard questions, such as, why exactly do you need to know when I take the bus and that it's specifically me? Why do you need so many cameras made in China everywhere? What is the benefit for me or my fellow citizens of this or that so-called smart city policy? Unlike other issues, this one will be decided in your community. And if this issue concerns you, you should be in the mayor's office or the city or county council instead of consuming internet narratives. Unlike other issues which require national or even transnational awareness, this one requires you to convince your community. So the good word from the sofa is this. If 15-minute cities is a concern for you, whether you are for or against it, log off from the internet and start knocking the doors. It will be decided mostly in your local elections. The name 15-minute cities is a fad that will pass just like the fad of smart cities passed. But the policies will remain in fashion for quite some time. In fact, they've been growing in popularity in most of Europe over the last 15 years or so. More likely than not, statistically speaking, you and your town will be fine. So approach this issue rationally rather than with panicardism and conspiratorial thinking. Or, for those who favor this, approach this issue with a lot less Stakhanovism, or else you won't like the results at all. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me to the killing fields. And with that occasion, I will also show you walkability in Southeast Asia and how they do things. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.